So welcome all. I'm Jose Alvarez, a faculty director of U.S. Asia Law Institute here at NYU, and welcome to our Global Japan series. Today we're discussing Nippon Steel-U.S. steel and the implications for U.S.-Japan relations. We're greatly honored to have three real experts on this topic, which is a really timely one, given that has come up in the presidential campaign. And so I will refrain from saying anything more. So let me just introduce the speakers. And at the beginning, Bruce Aronson will present some data for those of you who are just becoming familiar with the topic. So first is William Chou. He's the Deputy Director of Hudson Institute's Japan Chair. His work at Hudson focuses on U.S.-Japan relations in Indo-Pacific, and his forthcoming book is Made for America, Post-War Japanese Exports and the Evolution of U.S.-Japan Relations, which examines U.S.-Japan security, business, and cultural relations from the perspective of Japanese commercial trade. And by the way, the bios, the more extensive ones, are on the website, an announcement of today's panel. Second up is Hiroyuki Nishimura, who's a journalist who has covered extensive topics including monetary policy, finance markets, the global economy, trade, and economic diplomacy. He was formerly the news editor for Nikkei Asian Review and the chief New York correspondent. He also anchors a TV news show at BSTV Tokyo. And more familiar to us here at U.S. Asia Institute is the Bruce Aronson, who's the senior advisor at the Japan Center for us and an adjunct professor here at NYU. He's been a tenured professor of law at various universities in the U.S. and also Japan. And I'll turn it over to Bruce, who will say a few words about what it is we're talking about.
Thank you, Jose. Welcome, everyone in the room and online. About every 4 or 5 years, something happens where people who don't normally follow Japan get interested in it. And 4 or 5 years ago, that was the Carlos Ghosn case. And we duly, at the Japan Center, we try to engage with the public in those episodes where people are interested. So if you look on our website, we do have a symposium on comparative criminal justice, making sense of the Carlos Ghosn case. So now we have another one, 4 or 5 years later. We have the pending acquisition by Nippon Steel of U.S. Steel. We hope by early next year to have a similar symposium on our website, which will present essays from people with very different views and perspectives, which will help us learn about the case. But to start things off today, we have 2 excellent speakers. We're not going to focus on the merits of the transaction. We're interested in the broader implications for U.S.-Japan relations. And secondarily, we haven't heard much from our friends in Japan on this. People seem rather cautious about making public statements. So our 2 panelists today can directly address the question of impact on U.S.-Japan relations and what are the Japanese thinking about this case and its implications. So we're looking forward to this discussion as kind of a starting point of our activities involving this case and its broader impact. So to start things off, I'd just like to ask each of the speakers, what's your one takeaway from this case? What struck you the most about the transaction itself and its possible implications? Will you start, please?
Sure. Yeah, hi. Thank you all for being here. I'm William Chou from the Hudson Institute. I guess in terms of covering this issue for the past year, I think what struck me the most is that essentially what everyone had assumed at the beginning, and including myself, was that this was fundamentally a political situation, right? It's election year politics. The union is going to use its political leverage as much as it can. Pennsylvania is a battleground state. Everyone just assumed that it was a political issue. But I think over time, I think some observers have started to realize that this is actually not a political issue. This is an internal union issue in terms of union sort of decisions and specifically union leadership decisions. And so I think the fact that we, for so long, thought that it was a political issue meant that a lot of the things that were said in terms of the claims of Nippon Steel's unwillingness to provide guarantees or accusations of national security concerns and so on and so forth, these claims made by the loudest voices in the rooms, like Dave McCall and Joe Biden, were left unchallenged in the media. There was no real taking them to task and asking the hard questions of, okay, so now what then? And so because we just assumed it was a political issue and that eventually it would work itself out after the election, we gave them all a pass. But increasingly, I think, at least in my case, I started realizing probably sometime in May that the union's actions were inconsistent with this idea of, okay, well, they're going to leverage they're going to do maximum political leverage. They're going to secure the best deal they can on Nippon Steel by just raising the stakes because they have the political backing to do so. That did not come to pass. Instead, what you saw was the union consistently avoid a meeting with Nippon Steel to hash out these grievances or these concerns that they had and ultimately negotiate the best result for their members. That did not happen. And increasingly, I started realizing by May or June that fundamentally they wanted the deal dead. And so that creates a number of implications. The first question is, and I apologize, my screen just went blank, but it essentially is three major implications. Is, okay, so what? So what does this mean for the U.S. Steel union workers, right? Where does this leave them? U.S. Steel has said that if this deal does not go through, they cannot sustain the blast furnace plants in Gary, Indiana, as well as in the Mon Valley, Pennsylvania. So what happens to the workers? Two, what accounts for the union, the USW's great faith in Cleveland Cliffs, which it actually has a contracted deal to basically serve as their bargainer in the case that U.S. Steel is sold. So what exactly accounts for their faith in Cleveland Cliffs that they will be able to accomplish what Nippon Steel can't? And then third is ultimately we're starting to see the divergence between union leadership and the individual union members. And I think that's really key to focus on because people always talk about how they support American workers and they support unions. But I think increasingly you see during the election when I think the Teamsters sat out the vote for support for Kamala Harris, whereas and Donald Trump, but individual Teamster unions provided backing for Donald Trump during the campaign. And so I think increasingly what I think we need to be aware of is the divergence between union leadership, which oftentimes have their own priorities and motivations, and that of individual union members or local union, union locals. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Will. We'll interesting ideas that we'll get back to in a minute. Hiro, please go ahead.
Yeah, so what struck me most was the level of attention that this deal attracted in Japan, right? Among politicians, policymakers, and business people. And I think it has somewhat become a symbol of how the United States perceives Japan, or the relationship with Japan. You know, in September, there was the LDP presidential race in Japan. Right? Now 9 candidates ran, and they wanted to become the president, who would also be granted the position of the prime minister, because the LDP is the leading party in Japan, right? And they held a series of debates, most of them televised, and in each one of those debates, you know, this issue of Nippon Steel came up, right? And you know, it attracted a lot of attention. And in one debate, which I watched, the moderator actually asked all the 9 candidates to raise their hands if they thought, you know, if they intend to fight against the United States if the deal is dead, right? I don't know exactly what fight against the United States means, but anyway, you know, they all raised their hands. And you know, I think that kind of captured the sentiment among, you know, Japanese business people and policymakers, and I just thought it was symbolic. And I tried to think, identify what the reason was behind them people being so interested and politicians being so against the U.S. stance of, possibly rejecting the deal. And it's probably, one reason is probably because, Japan thought it is being treated as similarly as China, which is an adversary of the United States. Japan is not comfortable about, being, falling into the same category as China. There are other, lots of other reasons, I think. But, I think that was one thing that was striking to me.
Thank you very much. My quick takeaway was twofold. My first question about the deal itself was, so what is the national security interest of the United States? And I'm not an expert in this area, and I realize that partly because of competition with China, we have been tightening our approach. Nevertheless, steel seems to be a commodity, and Japan is our most important ally in the Asia-Pacific. So what is the national security interest? And related to that, secondarily, would this case pose some obstacles for continuing foreign direct investment by Japan or other countries into the U.S.? How do we balance the need for foreign direct investment and national security concerns? And is this just happening in the U.S., or is this part of a more general global trend to emphasize national security more than before? And I promised Jose that I would give in less than 3 minutes a summary of the case for those of you who haven't been following it. So perhaps a little bit out of order, but I'll be glad to do that. So as we all know, U.S. Steel is a very famous, iconic steelmaker, but has not really been doing very well in recent years. It's troubled. In August of last year, it announced that it had received multiple unsolicited takeover bids. And then at the same time, Cleveland Cliffs, which Will mentioned, announced that it had made a bid of a little over $7 billion to acquire U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel undertook a strategic review to try to get the best possible deal, and they came up with an offer from Nippon Steel that was twice as large, over $14 billion. And Nippon Steel also made a number of pledges to keep the name, to keep the Pittsburgh headquarters, to invest, to modernize aging steel plants. And the two parties, Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel, reached an agreement last December. This April, U.S. Steel shareholders were happy about a deal that was twice as big as the one last year, and 98% of the voting shares approved the transaction. As Will mentioned, at least the head of the United States Steelworkers Union was opposed to this transaction pretty consistently. And politicians on both sides jumped in during the presidential campaign to make negative comments about the deal. And since, of course, Nippon Steel is a foreign buyer, it is subject to national security review by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, abbreviated CFIUS, which is an abbreviation you'll probably hear a fair amount of today, in addition to antitrust review. And CFIUS, which is headed by the Treasury Department, it's an interagency committee, as I mentioned, safeguards national security interests, and the latest data show that Japan is the largest foreign direct investor into the United States. So in that sense, it's not surprising that Japan might get caught up in something. As Will mentioned as well, this became a political issue. There was, not an October surprise, but a September surprise, a report that the Biden administration was going to have the CFIUS committee immediately make a negative recommendation, and President Biden would block the transaction. And there was strong negative reaction to that, and for whatever reason, that did not happen. In fact, the CFIUS committee made a 3-month postponement, and now we're expecting their decision next month in December. Since then, Nippon Steel has tried to do what it could to promote the transaction, pledging to increase the investment, to modernize the steel mills. Also, the current president of U.S. Steel has made some hints that there might be negative consequences both to the company and to workers if this deal doesn't go through. And the executive vice president who's in charge of negotiating it is supposed to be in the U.S. next week to meet with interested parties, including the union, I think, to try to have the deal close. Unlike the Carlos Ghosn case, I don't think anyone's going to come here in a music box or whatever the problem was. It's above board and beyond that. But I think that's the current situation. We still don't know what the outcome is. We're still waiting to hear from CFIUS, and the parties are still trying to close the transaction. So with that in mind, let's explore some of the implications of this transaction. A number of them our panelists have already mentioned. I suppose the most basic policy issue is, as I mentioned briefly, what's the trade-off between foreign direct investment, which almost everyone universally says is a good thing economically, as opposed to national security considerations, which seem to be more on top of mind for everyone these days. So do you have any sort of general overview of how we should think about balancing those two interests? Any comments on that? Will, would you go ahead, please?
Sure. I mean, look, I think there's always a sort of a tension between FDI and national security, as you correctly point out. I think in this case, though, I think it's important to sort of keep it clear, though, what you mean by when you talk about national security, right? So in terms of this deal, obviously there have been claims of threats to national security. Obviously, that happened partly during the Trump administration when they put in the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, citing that steel and aluminum are strategic products that are critical to our national security, and thus they need to be hit with tariffs. And so I think there is that natural connection there. But specifically to this case, it's important to point out that none of U.S. Steel's production of steel actually goes into DoD. Right, so that sort of negates one of the national security arguments on this part. Two, obviously Japan is our most important, closest ally. I mean, to the point where you talked about CFIUS earlier. One might say that the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, which is one of the most hawkish, committees in Congress that have been really advocating for a much stronger line against China. They themselves argued back in December last year that right now, in terms of review of foreign FDI in the United States, right now the traditional Five Eyes, so UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, their transactions are actually expedited. They are not really subject to CFIUS review. They're expedited. And the House Select Committee recommended that Japan be added to that quote-unquote CFIUS whitelist. And so that is the esteem that we give Japan in terms of our trust in them in this alliance. So I would say is that in terms of the balance between FDI and national security, I think national security is paramount. It is a real concern given these challenging times, and especially given that in terms of the Chinese threat, it is a all-hands, multidimensional approach that they are adopting on both the traditional security grounds as well as economic grounds and other aspects. But it's important to make sure that we keep national security, especially the national security obligation of CFIUS, focused on national security and not expand it or sort of dilute its meaning and its significance. That's what I would sort of emphasize.
Is my memory or recollection correct that there was no definition of national security in the legislation?
That I cannot. That I might have a little difficulty to say, but I mean, it's also national security is one of those things where I think it's fairly, to quote, Potter Stewart, you kind of know it when you see it, and I think there's a difference. I think there's an inclination to spread national security into national interest, and that creates a slippery slope. Well, at that point, then it really does become politicized, right? Because you can say, oh, well, it's an election year. I need to win North Carolina, and so thus I will declare, the textile industry to be a national security issue. When it might be a national interest issue, but if you start redefining that as national security, then you really go down the slippery slope. And I think it's important to make sure that the institution of CFIUS, which is important to safeguarding our national security and sort of the threats abroad in terms of investments in the United States, and possibly taking our IP or hollowing out our industry, I think it's important to make sure that CFIUS remains focused on national security and not be politicized to focus on election year political interests.
Okay. Hiro, do you have any thoughts about the balance between national
Yeah,
security and
As
foreign
Will
direct
pointed
investment?
out, yeah. So national security is something very hard to define, right? There's a imaginary monster called Niue in Japan, right? And this Niue has a face of a monkey, I think, and a body of a raccoon, limbs of tigers, and tail of snakes, and it makes sounds like birds, And one government official said to me when I was discussing this matter, national security is like Niue, right? It's very hard to define, and it can be anything. It can mean anything. So, as Will said, there's a slippery slope. And so this government official said, we need to keep in mind that national security should basically stick to something that has military implication. We should not expand the definition of national security. And another point I would bring up is that I think clear lines should be drawn between, friendly or ally nations and adversaries, right? Allied country, I think, basically should be treated as same as U.S. domestic companies, except for some marginal cases. I understand, maybe the U.S. wouldn't want to allow maker of, advanced radar system owned by Japanese or French companies. That I understand, but those are, really rare cases. So basically, I think, the CFIUS should give a green light to allies or friendly nations. And it's, all the more important because we're all talking about, onshoring nowadays, right? And onshoring means, bringing production inside the United States. And that requires a lot of investment, right? And the issue is, can U.S. do that alone? And I don't think so. And just to give you an example, U.S. doesn't make any minivans anymore inside the United States, nor does it make, like Dell computers, and not to speak of cell phones, right? And if you want to, onshore production of even some part of these things, I think, overseas investment is crucial, right? So I think, the question now is how to limit foreign, it's not how to limit foreign investment, it's how to invite and welcome. And that's going to be important, not only for national security, but also for onshoring process, which will be conducive to national security.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned at the start, we want to focus more on kind of the broader implications of this case and not on the merits of the case itself. So what's the takeaway about the impact of this case on future FDI investment into the U.S. by Japan? Does it really represent a shift in thinking by the U.S., and would it result in Japanese companies who are interested in investing in Japan altering their investment criteria or their policies in any way? I don't care who goes first. Will, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I think part of the reason why I've been so rather insistent on arguing that this is not a political issue, or rather it's the sort of the idea that it being an election year, that's why this is happening right now. I think that's exactly to that point, right? When I talk to Japanese industry, my advice is always that the United States still continues to welcome FDI. You speak on let me set it up a little differently. You speak to American. I'm sorry, apologies. Ultimately, this is not a political year. This is a very specific, unique situation where I would argue that the USW Steelworkers Union leadership really is opposed to the deal for their own internal reasons. You look at the same time back in September when President Biden was about to kill the deal, and it got leaked into the press. At the same time, Kubota bought out a Pittsburgh-based robotics firm, right? And so, and there was obviously no backlash there. And so it's an obvious case where it's not really an election year issue. It's not a political issue. It's a union internal sort of logic issue. And so I think it's important to point this out and to reassure Japanese industry that, and all industries of American allies, that the United States continues to welcome FDI. And I think this is the point that certainly, even more so that you make this point beyond Washington, out into the states and the sort of local municipalities, right? So governors and mayors, you talk to them, and you will be reminded how important FDI is to their communities. I think it's one of those things where certainly things can be very politicized in D.C., but governors and mayors make their get reelected or get elected by being able to bring in investment of all kinds, be it from domestic or foreign. And so I think again, my large argument is that I believe the United States, especially if you talk to governors and mayors, it is still a robust, healthy enthusiasm for foreign direct investment from Japan, from other allied nations, and I would not treat this case as emblematic of some kind of shift in American attitudes towards FDI.
Okay, well, that's a clear response. One-off case. Hiro, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to disagree. Maybe it's a one-off thing for the Americans, but I think there will be damage in the trust of Japanese business circle towards the U.S. And I think anecdotally, we're seeing that already. I hear a lot of people are visiting Washington, D.C., either for lobbying or for research. They all want to know what's going to happen, whether the United States has changed its stance, right? And I think the business circle is very concerned that their potential acquisition in the United States may be blocked. So, business people, they tell me the sectors which are sensitive or has implication to military affairs will be will see immediate threat. But I think the implication will be far beyond. It will just spread to manufacturing companies in general. So in case of steel, there's an estimate saying that of all the steel products produced within the United States, only 3% goes to the U.S. military. And U.S. Steel doesn't even have direct transactions with U.S. Steel. And if still the deal is blocked, that kind of signals that any deal can be blocked at any time. Too much discretion on the side of CFIUS. And I'm sure that's going to create fears within the Japanese companies. They'll think twice.
Okay. Well, let's follow up on that. Let's circle back on the Japanese view. You mentioned that at least recently politicians seem to be willing to talk about this case, but I don't notice Japanese government officials or business people talking about this case. They seem quite cautious. What's your impression of how people generally in Japan, and certainly about the Japanese media, how has this case been seen more generally, and why do some areas of Japanese society who should be interested seem reluctant to talk about it? Do you have any thoughts on that? Hiro, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah.
You're our expert on this.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see a lot of government-related people in this room as well. And the reason I'm here is because they don't want to come here and talk. And I know the reason. I know that an internal memo was circulating within the Japanese government before the election, urging policymakers not to make public commentary on this case. And I understand. Actually, the memo cites the reason. It says, any commentary, public commentary made by government officials will be interpreted as an intervention to domestic politics in the United States. It's a very delicate time. So I think, you know, they were right to be keep a low profile. But anyway, that's why they're quiet. But they have been following the case very closely, and they're worried. And, you know, there have been multiple reports saying that the Japanese government is actually in contact with CFIUS. And I think it's right. I know it's right. And I don't think it's a negotiation of a kind, but the Japanese government has been messaging CFIUS that the Japanese government and the business sector thinks this deal is very important. So that's the government side. As for the business circle, they have made various official statements. Like the Japanese Business Federation or the Japan-U.S. Business Council, they said CFIUS should make the decision objectively and without politicizing the issue. So their, you know, position is very clear. And as for the Japanese media, you know, we're kind of unanimously supported in this case. And one of the reasons is that Japanese people know that, you know, in order to expand overseas market, direct investment will be very, very important. And this is even more so when the Japanese domestic market is shrinking due to demographic reasons. And we know that the incoming president does not want increased trade surplus, right? So the only way is probably to invest in the United States and produce more in the United States. So as for Nikkei, my company, I just looked up the database and we wrote over 200 stories on this case since the deal was announced last December. And that included five editorials, which all, you know, urged CFIUS to be objective and stick to the basic. So, you know, if you want to know, if you ask how the Japanese public or the business or the government is feeling about this case, they all want the case to go through.
Has there been any change at all since the U.S. presidential election is now ended? Has that freed people up to speak more openly, in your view? Hiro, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we're just starting to see it. I don't think they will suddenly start speaking up, but people who are closely observing this matter, and actually Nippon Steel, they're, I think, boosting their efforts to negotiate with the CFIUS. That's why officials will be coming here pretty soon, right? Actually, I've been hearing voices saying that under the Trump administration, they might have a better chance, right? So Nippon Steel Vice President Mr. Mori said he wants to close the deal within this year under the Biden administration, right? We don't know if that's going to happen. I think Nippon Steel is confident. That's at least what I see from his comment. But if it doesn't go through, I think a better tactic will be to, you know, withdraw the plan and try it again under the Trump administration. And people say this because they think, and we all know that Mr. Trump is more transactional. So if Nippon Steel can sweeten the deal so as to benefit the workers and perhaps the incoming president himself, the deal could, go through. Whereas Mr. Biden is a friend of the USW, President Mr. McCall, and he might actually block this deal to make it his pleasure. So
Okay.
people are turning optimistic.
Okay. Well, we all want to be optimistic these days. That's excellent. So, Will, do you have any thoughts on your perception of what's the view in Japan, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly Hiro has a much better beat on sort of the feeling in Japan. I think in regards to your previous comments about FDI in the United States, I recognize those concerns by Japanese industry. But I guess my argument is that at the end of the day, right, they do surveys of Japanese industry. The Japanese government does, I think both JETRO as well as JBIC do studies of Japanese industry in terms of where are they most confident in terms of their foreign investments, right? And the United States is always in the top three. I believe it's number 2 this year. I think number 1 is India, then it's the U.S., and it's Vietnam, right? And so ultimately, look, obviously the Japanese market itself is not a growing market. So Japanese companies have to look abroad for their growth. And the United States offers the best combination of both growth as well as rule of law, right? Both of which provides stability, which obviously is very important to industry. And so at the end of the day, the United States remains the most attractive developed world, fully developed, developed world market that is appealing to Japanese firms, and that's the reason why Nippon Steel decides to invest in the United States, to pay a 40% overcharge for U.S. steel. And so I think it's important to remember the fundamentals of the market, which is that the United States is a growing and vibrant market with the highest prices for steel in the world. And I would argue that despite this case, which I still argue is a one-off, the fundamentals of attracting Japanese FDI into the United States are still very strong.
Okay. Let's talk for a minute about sort of non-U.S. broader implications, starting with Japan and then globally. So Japan has a very low level of FDI, and currently the government has a program to try to promote it. Is there any talk of Japan, if this deal doesn't go through, Japan should also strengthen its national security measures or emphasize them more than before? Is that a topic of conversation in Japan, Hiro?
Yeah, so I've actually spoken about this possibility with people in the trade circle, and I don't think there will be any kind of blatant retaliation. Because, right now, Japan is urging CFIUS to stick to the principle, right? And if, just because one deal is blocked, if Japan suddenly takes a tit-for-tat tactics, that's going to ruin the reputation of Japanese people, the Japanese government. So I don't think they want to do that. But I think, there will be resentment among policymakers and politicians. There could be some, push from politicians to take retaliatory measures. We did it with South Korea when, the bilateral relationship worsened. It weaponized trade by blocking semiconductor materials export to South Korea. So that's one risk, although I think the risk is lower given that the United States is a very strong ally of Japan. But I think where something can happen is in the very delicate negotiation on economic national security matters between Japan and the United States. For example, the United States has long pressured Japan to, stop the export of semiconductor equipment to China, right? And companies like Tokyo Electron, they're trying to push back the U.S. pressure, and the Japanese government is trying to find a middle ground. And it's been a very, very tough negotiation. If U.S. blocks the Nippon Steel deal. This deal has nothing to do with Nippon Tokyo Electron deal, but I think Japanese policymakers can be reluctant in trying to coordinate with the United States. So there will be implications, although it wouldn't be blatant.
Okay, so U.S. outbound regulations, although not directly relevant, could nevertheless become another topic of conversation. Will, do you have any thoughts on either FDI into Japan, and why don't we also get your thoughts on whether this greater emphasis on national security might be part of an overall global trend?
Sure. Let me just answer the first question first. So I think in terms of inbound investment into Japan, I think that's been an issue that, ultimately I think the U.S.-Japan relationship is structurally sound, right? Because at the end of the day, our overall overarching concerns, right, which is security in the Pacific region, as well as our strong and healthy economic relationship between the two countries. I think those are two fundamentals that I think will not radically shift the nature of the relationship, right? So regardless of what happens on this deal, I think the U.S.-Japan relationship remains strong. That said, I will say that in terms of investments into Japan, I think that's, there's been some arguments about how, Japan would never allow U.S. Steel to buy Nippon Steel. Well, that's not exactly a convincing argument because Nippon Steel is the fourth largest steelmaker in the world and U.S. Steel is the 32nd. I think if you look at the history of Japanese business acquisitions or sales, there have been major business units at sort of like standing leading Japanese companies like Hitachi and Olympus that have gone to foreign buyers, right? So the argument that Japan would not permit its own assets to be sold overseas I don't think is a convincing one. Moreover, the previous Kishida administration really emphasized the need for foreign investment into Japan, right? This is part of this desire to sort of like, how do we jumpstart the Japanese economy? How do we focus more on sort of more innovative startup type culture that they have in Silicon Valley? And so that's been a real emphasis by the Kishida administration, both in terms of reforming Japan's retirement investment measures, encouraging startups, startup culture, creating I think what they call smart cities or investment zones within Japan, right? So that's been a real area of emphasis, and they've been wanting to attract more foreign investment in Japan. And given that the current Prime Minister Ishiba was able to become Prime Minister because of the support for Kishida, and I believe the economic measures were part of the deal in him becoming Prime Minister in exchange for Kishida support, I expect Japan to actually continue to be fairly, engaging of foreign investment into Japan. And then I think just in terms of what Hiro said, in terms of the implications, I don't think there will be direct repercussions between the U.S. and Japan, but I do think that on areas of economic security cooperation, right, be it in semiconductor export regulations or cooperation over LNG projects in the region, I think one of the great advances in Japanese foreign policy in the past 12 years has been that Japan has increasingly taken a much more active role in the region. It's now a rule maker as well as just in terms of just going beyond just being there and happy to help. They're actually taking an active role in the region. And I think events like this may discourage Japan from taking that active role, taking that initiative that we've been asking, that the United States have been asking Japan for such a long time. And I fear that this, if this deal does not go through, it may deter Japan from wanting to show that initiative and go back to the old patterns of following the U.S. and letting the U.S. tell it what to do.
There are questions here.
Okay, I really wanted to circle back and ask you about unions, but I think the questions come first.
Okay, so at this point, those who are watching, you should, if you have questions, there are already some in the Q&A box, write them in, and I'll just proceed to look at the ones that strike out. Some have already been the subject of discussion, but one is on the union side, and this one is about how should the unions have faith in the management of the new company? And how does union management get confidence that should the acquisition go through, it would even reach antitrust scrutiny? That is, what I think it raises is nothing has been said about the antitrust side of the ledger. Maybe there is no serious question there, but I guess that's one issue that is raised here. Either one.
Please.
I can take this if need be. Just in terms of the guarantee, I mean, I think in terms of what assurance does the union have that Nippon Steel will honor its obligations? Well, I think that's a multi-part answer. One is the fact that they had an arbitration case that was ruled at the end of August that declared that Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel, in terms of their deal, would ensure the basic labor agreement, which is the primary mechanism that engages between the union and U.S. Steel, was valid, and it was followed through to the letter. And there are no more legal issues in terms of the acquisition of U.S. Steel by Nippon Steel. That Nippon Steel would honor the basic labor agreement. So that's one of the guarantees. Two is the fact that frankly there's a lot of public pressure on this thing, and there's going to be a lot of public scrutiny, and I think that will continue even after if the deal were to sort of conclude. I think there will be a lot of attention paid to Nippon Steel to make sure that it honors its commitments. In terms of antitrust, the antitrust problem is actually more for Cleveland-Cliffs. There is no antitrust issue for Nippon Steel. That was one of the real attractions of this potential Nippon Steel-U.S. Steel deal, is the fact that they have so little overlap, and there was no real antitrust concerns. One which was raised was essentially Nippon Steel's joint venture with ArcelorMittal down in Alabama, which Nippon Steel has proactively gone in and basically divested itself from that joint venture to ensure that there would not be any antitrust issues. Rather, the antitrust issues are really with more a potential Cleveland-Cliffs U.S. Steel purchase, by which, look, the statistics are out there. It would be like essentially the new Cleveland-Cliffs U.S. Steel combined entity would dominate the manufacture of automotive steel. It would dominate the production of iron ore. It would dominate the production of specialty electric steel needed for EVs, which obviously we know is a priority of this current administration's. And so that's really where the antitrust issues are. And even Cleveland-Cliffs itself has agreed that, yes, if we were to acquire U.S. Steel, we would actually have to divest. I think they estimated at $2.2 billion worth. I think U.S. Steel believes it's close to like $6 billion. But in any case, they would have to divest in order to meet antitrust, and that would inevitably mean the loss of jobs and employment, and it would be devastating to the local economies. And so that's always been the concern. The antitrust concerns have really been on the not Nippon Steel options. And I think that's really been an angle that I really wish there has been more attention given to.
Any additional comments on
Why
that?
don't we go ahead?
Okay.
Sorry.
So there's another question here that takes a rather different question about what exactly is Nippon Steel buying. Some suspicion here that they want to shut down the blast furnaces and that they're under pressure to do so. Why is it that this is attractive to Nippon Steel, and why should we assume that the business will continue as is?
Well, that's a good question as well, and I think anyone could answer it. I think it's attractive, as Will mentioned, because the U.S. is the most dynamic growing economy, and Japan is demographically aging and shrinking, and so there's a very strong incentive for all major Japanese companies to invest more and more overseas. From the beginning, Nippon Steel has made very significant pledges of investment to modernize the steel plants of U.S. Steel. I think it was $1.4 billion initially, and after the story that Biden might block the transaction, they moved forward with their sweeteners and put in another $1.3 billion, as I recall. The big business with U.S. Steel is the automotive industry, and that's very attractive. And So there are good reasons, both absolutely in terms of how the U.S. is doing and relatively compared to the situation in Japan, why Nippon Steel should be very interested in U.S. steel and in using the plants. And Will, you want to add something?
I apologize. I will note that just to do a self-plug, my colleague Paul Sarasic and I will be coming out with a comprehensive study report on sort of this Nippon Steel-U.S. steel deal in the coming weeks. So please look out for that. But just to speak on sort of the technical side, I know that there's been this argument that Nippon Steel is trying to acquire U.S. Steel purely for its electric arc plants down in Arkansas instead of the blast furnace plants up in Gary and in Indiana and Pennsylvania. But I would just say that one, you can't just rely on electric arc furnaces, which essentially use scrap metal to make steel. That's great. It's efficient. But at the same time, there is actually a finite amount of scrap metal available, right? Ultimately, you still have to produce steel from the traditional methods of iron ore and putting it in blast furnaces and turning it to steel. And so that's part of the appeal of having these traditional blast furnace plants in Pennsylvania and Indiana. And I will also add that Nippon Steel has technology that will essentially use hydrogen instead of oxygen in the making of blast furnace steel that will make it, one, more efficient and more economical, aka lower prices and more competitive, while also achieving some of there'll be less essentially emissions as a result of this process that will make them as competitive as electric arc steel in terms of emissions and price in the coming decade or two. And so there are real technical reasons why they want to buy the blast furnace plants in Pennsylvania and Indiana. It is not just a case where they just want Arkansas, the electric mill furnaces in Arkansas.
There is one factual question, and that is how many U.S. steel laborers today are members of the USW? I guess there's also asking generally the power of the USW beyond this company. And, anybody have data on that?
I know that the union organization, union membership rate was something like 30% in the early 1960s, and now it's down to 10%. So that's for the whole, U.S. economy. I don't know the specific numbers for the steel industry. But what's interesting to me is that the approval rate of unions is on the rise since the financial crisis in 2008, and it's something like 70%, I think, according to St. Paul. And what's interesting is that I think Japanese companies, and including Nippon Steel, was kind of blindsided about this empowerment of labor unions in recent years. And that's probably why Nippon Steel didn't pay enough attention or didn't recognize the importance to engage more with the unions. And actually, a prominent Japanese lawyer criticized that point. That was actually the start of the failure. And I think President McCall of USW actually noted that one reason he's opposed to this deal is because of the lack of engagement by Nippon Steel to the union. So I think there's a lesson.
But presumably that lack of engagement was upon the advice of U.S. Steel, who also had very bad historical relations.
Actually, I'm sorry. Just quickly, in terms of numbers, my understanding is that there are 10,000 USW members within U.S. Steel. That is not a majority of the USW membership, and it's important to realize that when the USW speaks on this deal, USW doesn't just represent the USW workers within US Steel, it is also representative of all USW members. And so that does bring into the issue of basically there are 10,000 USW members within US Steel. My understanding is that at Cleveland Cliffs there are about 15,000 USW members at Cleveland Cliffs. And so I think this creates a question of what is the rationale within the USW leadership? What are their incentives? What is their ultimate logic and objectives? And I think that raises some questions there. In terms of the union engagement, I do believe that, look, it's important that, I think going forward, right, I think Nippon Steel certainly made a mistake by not having a presence, a stronger presence in the United States. I think it needed a stronger ground game to begin with. But there were also legal constraints on their ability to engage with the union, because essentially the union, when U.S. Steel put itself onto the market to be sold, they had tried to approach the union with, okay, we will give you privileged information on the sale, but you have to sign an NDA, right? But the fact that the USW essentially gave its bargaining rights over to buy U.S. Steel to Cleveland Cliffs meant that it was effectively a competitor against Nippon Steel in the acquisition. And so there are actual legal reasons why Nippon Steel could not engage directly with the USW. So I think, in general, engagement with the union is important. You do want to have stakeholders, all the stakeholders involved. But in this case, there were actual legal restrictions on the Nippon Steel and the USW engagement that the USW chose to ignore and reject.
Okay, yes, anyone in the room want to ask? Yeah.
Question. This is on. Yeah. Question for Mr. Nishimura.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the current prime minister is a little sensitive to export surplus, and FDI may be a better way to be doing these things. But since Nippon Steel was announced, the yen is perhaps at least 10% weaker, and perhaps getting weaker. Do you think that changes plans in government or just in Japan Inc. to use FDI as a way to, further the political economy?
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't think the Japanese government will change its stance just because there's a fluctuation in the currency market. And as a matter of fact, I think one reason Japanese business want to have more FDI in the United States is because of the recent weakening of the yen, right? I talked to a lot of companies, not only big ones, but small, small and medium-sized company people too. And, take a ramen shop, for example, right? Ramen can cost only 500 yen in Japan, right? And over here, it can be up to like $30 when it's converted into yen. And the recent high inflation and quasi-deflation in Japan has widened the gap even further. So the thinking of Japanese companies is that you go to the United States and you sell in the United States, you make a lot more profit than operating business in Japan. So I think that's one push that the FDI is getting nowadays.
Thank you.
We got time for one more question in the room? Yes.
I'm old enough to remember that in 1984, Japanese company called NKK bought National Steel, took a controlling position in 1984. And I think there was no national security issue since then. And in my view, in fact, I was in the law firm which represented NKK. So post-acquisition, I was involved in some of the issues they're having. So no national security issue, has been raised, I guess, at the time, and no actual issues surfaced after the acquisition. So, it's a settled issue in a sense. Two, during the time NKK owned National Steel, they moved the headquarters from Pittsburgh to South Bend. Is it in the institutional memory of the union if they didn't like that move? Those are my questions.
A quick answer because we need to end up.
Okay. I'll just chime in. Well, it's important to know that NKK is actually now part of Nippon Steel, because I think Nippon Steel. No.
NKK is not, is JFE now.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize to my JFE friends there. In any case, in any case, though, I think, yeah, I mean, as you correctly point out, right, in 1984, that acquisition did go through. And this goes back to a previous question of, what guarantees can Nippon Steel provide to the workers and unions? And I think one of the angles that has really been under-examined is the fact that Nippon Steel has already been in the United States for 20 years now, right, through, I'm sorry, for 40 years now, right, through its ownership of Standard Steel, as well as Wheeling Nippon Steel in West Virginia. And one of the things that I think Nippon Steel should have done more of is to emphasize its long-standing productive relationship with the workers in these plants, to demonstrate that they are able to negotiate in good faith and that the USW workers within US Steel should not be concerned. And in terms of, so I think there is precedence here. And this goes back to my larger argument, which is this is a very unique union-driven case rather than some real shift on national security.
Okay, I guess we really have to end on time. Let us thank our participants and Bruce Aronson for arranging all of this. Thank you all.